Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining KPIs for Sales. It's your host, Brandon Bornancin here, and I've got a special guest, Mr. Ed Porter, the Director of Inside Sales at Guest Supply, and he's also the President of the American Association of Inside Sales Professionals, the Columbus chapter. Mr. Porter, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Happy to be here. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, and by the way, we're connecting on a Saturday afternoon. I randomly called Ed, and I'm like, hey, man, you are like the guru of sales KPIs, of sales data. Every time that we connect, either at an event or on social or in person, whatever it may be, and we're chatting shop, we're always talking about KPIs. So I was like, who better than Mr. Ed Porter himself to cover everything there is to know about KPIs. And Ed, can you share a little bit about, what is Guest Supply and what is your role there? And then we could dive in.
Yeah, definitely. So Guest Supply is a manufacturer of those little soaps and shampoos that you see in your hotel rooms. We manufacture those for different brands. We also contract manufacture everything that's on the bed and in the bathroom, so anything with textile or cotton and polyester in it. We make towels, we make sheets, pillows, pillowcases, and we do that specifically for the lodging industry. Above being a manufacturer, we're also a full-service distributor, so anything and everything, or most everything and anything that hotels need to operate, we sell as well. So hotels are our core market, both the franchisee as well as the big national chains. So that's what we do at Guest Supply, and my role is I head up our inside sales organization. We have a large sales organization, predominantly field, but then we also have an inside sales team as well. So I've been doing this for a little over 7 years, and prior to coming here, I worked for a software startup here in the Columbus area and really learned the distribution side of the B2B sale. So been doing distribution in B2B for the past 9.5 years or so, and I'm loving it. So,
oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Thanks for taking the time out of the day, Ed, especially over the weekend, to chat with us about KPIs in sales development and outside sales and what we should pay attention to. And by the way, my favorite shampoo and conditioner are the mints. I forget what kind of mint, but the stuff that really mints up your hair, man. I love that stuff.
Oh, okay. All right. There's a couple different ones. Hopefully it's not a competitor one. So hopefully it's at a hotel chain that we do.
Awesome. Great. Well, let's talk about the importance first of sales development KPIs. So you manage the inside sales team at Guest Supply. There's thousands of, probably hotels, chains, you name it. Like, why are KPIs important for running, managing, executing sales development?
Yeah, I think they're certainly the lifeblood of really any operation, and they, when orchestrated properly, when managed properly, they really help you identify bottlenecks in a process. So I came from the call center world, and that world is driven by analytics. It's driven by data. Every second something happens is being measured, and that's kind of where I grew up in my, passion for data and analytics. But transitioning that now into sales, sales tends to be somewhat of a subjective term because it's a lot of conversation, it's a lot of talking, it's moving through a process, and some of that can't be as data-driven as much as I'd like it to be, or at least comparatively to the call center world. But now, with the advent of so much technology, now you have AI and layered machine learning, you have all sorts of different technology pieces that are starting to capture as much throughout customer inception, and I mean prospect as inception, the first time they experience your company, all the way down to purchase and service and repeatability. So throughout that whole process is really the essence of where you can optimize your process. How can you do it more effectively? How can you do it less expensively? And ultimately deliver that that wow type of service to your prospect and eventually to your customers. So where I feel sales KPIs are really the driving force is that helps you identify, paint that picture of what's going on and then how to make that process better.
Yeah, no, that's great feedback, and I totally understand the importance here. And I think, what was the old the old slogan, what gets measured gets done? I forget if that was Peter Drucker or who exactly stated that, but
yeah, I mean, what gets managed gets measured. Or what gets measured gets managed. Yeah, something like that. You're right.
What gets measured gets done. What gets managed gets measured. One of those. You just don't know where you're at, where you're trying to go, how to get there without having KPIs in place. I think for accomplishing anything, right? If you want to close more appointments, you need to measure the activities that book more appointments. If you want to lose weight, you got to measure the activities of exercise and what you're eating. If you want to measure, the cost of fuel for your car, you need to measure how far you're driving. I think in anything in life, you need to measure where you're at and where you want to go to accomplish your goals. So like sales development, to book more appointments, you need to measure the activities that drive appointments, if that's the end goal, or to book more revenue, book more pipeline. And, you manage a pretty massive team. So in your opinion, for new sales DevOps, sales dev managers, you name it, like let's start from the foundation. Where should we start managing KPIs for sales development teams, for SDRs?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the essence of this, and I may be on the other side of this fence comparatively to what a lot of people think in terms of sales KPI specifically for sales dev, is I think you need to measure the start of inception and whatever that is defined by, whether that's an incoming marketing lead and an outbound prospect or responding outbound to a marketing lead. I think those are some different things that you need to find a starting point. And then the other part is for the end point is in some sales development camps, the sales development reps are taking it all the way through to a first purchase. And then it gets handed over to an AE who then continues to grow it. In other cases, they're just like you said, Brandon, they're setting up a meeting. You're trying to qualify a prospect and then get that qualified prospect to a meeting. So depending on what function you're in, you need to really define that starting point and that end point. And the starting point is, I'm a huge fan of activity metrics and trying to understand what's happening, whether it's emails sent, whether it's phone calls made, whether it's even video calls made. What's that denominator, if you will, of how much activity is being done. And then the second part to that becomes the numerator, which is what's the success rate? And that success rate is measured either through a reply rate, through a conversation. I think those are two core ones, and I would put most emphasis on the conversation. I think that understanding how many conversations you have really open you up to understanding that whole first step of the process. How much outreach does it take in order to have a conversation becomes step one of that formula. So I'm a fan of tracking activity, although I don't like holding necessarily reps accountable to the activity. It's more of just an understanding of how effective that process is in order to step two. So if I make 100 calls in a day and I talk to 10 people, okay, that's 10%. That may be good, that may be bad. But I really care about that 10 number. And if you can talk to 10 people in 50 calls, then I think you're just better optimizing that process. But you really need to understand that how much activity and how much outreach is done. So those are the first two steps of that, is to figure out the outreach and then working towards that conversation.
Yeah, and I think looking at, those are great points. Looking at what is the revenue number, right? Okay, so if the revenue number is $1 million, what's the sales funnel needed to hit the revenue number, and then what's the sales activities that would generate that sales funnel to hit the revenue number? And I know one of the things that we look at Seamless number one, like the first thing we do, if the revenue number is $1 million, we start with what are the number of contacts and accounts needed to prospect to hit the revenue number. So if you contact 10 people, you book one appointment, and it takes 10 appointments to close a sale, and a sale equals $100,000, right? You could do that math to figure out, all right, we would need 100 people, 10 appointments, one closed sale. So we would need 1,000 people, 100 appointments, 10 sales to hit the $1 million number. So I know at Seamless, we're always looking at, okay, step one, how many contacts, ideal contacts and accounts do we need to hit our number? And then I guess once you know the amount of prospects, Ed, let's talk about some of the activities that we want to measure. So there's a lot of different channels, right? You've got calling, texting, voicemails, emailing, video, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, direct mail, events, in-person, content, account-based marketing. Like there's like 11 to 20 different channels that you can leverage in outbound sales. Let's talk about some of the ones that you guys measure, or some in your opinion that you need to measure for the activity once you've identified the amount of contacts and accounts that you need to sell to. Like what are those critical KPIs?
Yeah, definitely. I think the best answer to that question for anyone is really, where do your customers live? And sometimes that's known, sometimes it's not. But in some cases, people aren't answering the phone. In some cases, they're not on email. In some cases, they're all about text. So it's really trying to understand where that person lives, or where your prospect lives, or your ideal customer, whatever the case may be, is where do they live? And if you don't know, that's okay. That's the beauty of testing. Brandon, you and I have had many conversations about testing, and if you're unsure, go test it and try it. So that's really the first formative start, is to try and figure out where your prospect lives, and then try to, of course, engage with them through that channel. The battle that you officiated a few weeks ago between Mario Martinez and Gabe Larson, I think, was great, because it brought up both sides of the social selling versus cold calling debate. And the beauty of it is there's really no right or wrong, but you need to test for your environment, for where your customer is. But it is important to really eliminate as much bias as you can, and that's really tough to do when you have your own opinion and you generally want to justify it. But don't be afraid to test and try it. We've done the same thing here. I've been fortunate at the company that I'm at, where I've been able to sort of just cast that fishing line and see what bites. So we've found some things that work. We found some things that don't. We're still starting to perfect some things, but we've done social, we've done email, we've done video, we've done phone calls, and we start to see different results, even based on different segments. As for a company that's selling to multiple verticals, you may find if you're selling to healthcare, they respond more favorably. Your connection rate is higher in one channel than another. Whereas if you sell to transportation or you sell to education, you may have completely different conversation rates. And that's where I think that's the driver, and that's your pulse check is, again, how much outbound activity versus how much engagement, and understanding that percentage to try and understand what's the best route to take. So, text messaging is another big one that's probably more recent. Well, I guess between text messaging and video messaging, it's probably two of the most recent ones that are starting to get a lot of hype and a lot of traction. And I think it also depends on, again, what's most suitable and what's most acceptable. Text messaging, I've heard a lot from a lot of thought leaders that text messaging is a great channel once you've had a conversation or a couple conversations. It's a great tool to confirm a meeting. I've heard that from a lot of people. You got somebody on the phone, you've got them accepted to a meeting, and then simply say, hey, Brandon, is it okay if I text you the day before just to make sure you're still available Thursday at noon? And I think that's a great way to open up communication channels. There's software that tracks those text messages and activity, links them into your CRM if needed. So that, again, becomes another channel that can be tracked and measured. So I guess to answer the question is it really all depends. It's conditional, but for a manager or a company that doesn't quite know, just go out and test it and try it. And even like you said, Brandon, there's 11, 12, up to 20 different channels. Try them all. Some are going to be cost prohibitive, unfortunately. Some are going to be very beneficial, but really understanding what that's like, and especially throughout the sales process or the sales cycle, is also important to really just understand it. It's what I firmly believe, that everything you do should be about engaging with a prospect and or customer, and how you measure those is exactly where this whole KPI world comes into play, is being able to measure what's the most effective way to engage with my prospect or my customer, and then go do that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love the idea about texting, tracking that. We've started to talk to a few different companies that actually do that. We're also trying to figure out the best ways to track social prospecting. LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter activity tied back to Salesforce. I don't know if anyone's nailed it. If you've got any thoughts or recommendations on the easiest way to track those activities, that'd be great. I don't know of a turnkey solution for something like that.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm not sure. I know LinkedIn Sales Nav kind of does their own thing, and they've got a little small data set that you can use. But all in all, I think the hard part is you look at something like a CRM, and of course CRM is the foundation, but you have so many tools that are tying into CRM. So I think there becomes that integration piece of it to just understand what that looks like. And you're right, I don't know that, not to say there's not one, but I don't know if there is one that can look at your LinkedIn, your connections, or your in-mails, or your message frequency and response rate through that, and dump it into a CRM so you can analyze it. So if not, maybe that's an idea, Brandon. Go invent it.
Yeah. No, that's great. And then when it comes to, so you've done a lot with calling, and by the way, so I've never prospected to the hotel supply industry, like selling the personal care amenities that you guys sell. What channels, based off all the testing, so it sounds like you tested the 10 to 20 different outbound sales channels, like what have you seen work best as a mix for you and your team?
Yeah, without giving out our secret sauce, the biggest thing is, I think at some point it does revolve around a phone conversation, and whether if you're selling a transactional product, then maybe that can be done through electronic means. So it just really depends on the product, but really working towards a conversation is not, that conversation piece isn't dead. And I think even Mario said this, if not on the battle, on a previous time I've heard him talk, was it's not like one's replacing the other, but you're trying to use any means necessary to have that conversation with somebody. And sometimes pieces of a conversation can happen online, and sometimes the meat and potatoes is on the phone call. So for us, it's really just studying that conversation and making it happen towards that conversation. So we try to do a lot of activity that leads up to, let's have a phone call, and then let's get a sales rep on the line or in person to really just talk about understanding the best pain points, understanding where we might be able to be a fit, and get those conversations moving. So I guess that's what I'll say without giving away the farm of what we do and how we do it, but it does revolve around that conversation.
Yeah, I know I'm always working with you to learn more about selling over the phone, because I know you and your team, you do a ton of it, and it's amazing. I feel like every time we get together, I learn something new. When you're trying to measure KPIs as it relates to calling and outbound sales prospecting via the phone, what would you say some of those core calling KPIs are? Obviously, there's probably dials made or dial attempts made. What other calling KPIs in your mind are critical to measuring the performance of the team? And then we could go into some of the other channels, dissecting some of those.
Yeah. So even I'll kind of touch a little bit on what you had talked about just a second ago, but understanding what's the number and backing into the appointments and such. That process really rang true when I picked up a book called Predictable Revenue, and I think that's probably been a lot of the foundation with, of course, SaaS companies and as they're growing. But I think you really need to start from either the end and work your way back to the beginning and start to understand really what triggers can you improve upon to help make that result or that revenue attainable. So when you ask that question is really about it's understanding activity first, understanding success rate, and I measure success rate, at least in the SDR side, of conversations as well as email responses. So having some kind of engagement, it becomes step 2-ish, I guess, of the process. Step 1 is the activity. Step 2 is the conversation. And then understanding that ratio. How many conversations to a meeting? How many meetings to an opportunity? How many opportunities to customers? And then what that rate is and what the average revenue comes from those. So
that's awesome.
And that becomes very systemic. And I think that's exactly what that book, Predictable Revenue, lays out is if you can start to track every part of that from step 1 to step 2, step 3 and ongoing, then that allows you to keep an eye on your process. You can even a little bit go before that. I know we're talking primarily on the sales side or the sales development side, but even before that, there's a whole slew of marketing metrics. And as long as that marketing and sales team are aligned, you want them kind of starting to hit that, whatever activity that is on the marketing front, all the way down to how does the sales development rep take that baton and run with it, and then hand it off to the AE and run with it, and then hand it off to the customer success manager. So that's where identifying that process, mapping that process, and tracking each of those stages is going to just allow you to attain more predictable revenue.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you had also mentioned, before we jumped on the call, a book that we both read, Cracking the Sales Management Code, The Secrets to Measuring and Managing Sales Performance. This was actually the first book that I read on KPIs and sales KPIs after reading Predictable Revenue like 10 years ago. Jason Jordan, he's got a lot of incredible KPIs. Like one of my favorites that came out of the book, and I'd love to hear if you've got any other favorites, was pushing. So a push is when you have an opportunity in Salesforce and you change the close date. And the more pushes you have on an opportunity means the less likelihood to close that deal. Because if you're working a deal and you forecast that it's going to close in a month, and then you move it out another month, and then you move it out another month, it's like, okay, A, you're real shitty at forecasting, or B, you're smoking the hopium and this deal definitely doesn't exist. It's bullshit, and you just need to kill it versus moving out the close date. I think when I first started in sales, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing, like literally year 1, year 2, I would forecast deals to close, and I would constantly be pushing them out all the time. I'm trying to configure our Salesforce instance right now to track some of those KPIs. Are there any other KPIs, that you picked up from that book, and then we could continue diving into the different SDR KPIs?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's what your takeaway, Brandon, is really good, to be able to understand the relationship. I think that's the biggest thing, is understanding the likelihood of a deal pushing versus what does that mean to the deal closing. And those indicators are so valuable. So where I think what really opened my eyes in this book was, if I'm not mistaken, don't quote me on this number, but I think in the beginning of the book when they started going down this path of what metrics are important to leaders, sales leaders, I think they said when they surveyed everybody, there were slightly over 300 different sales KPIs that management looked at. And on one end, I looked at 300 and said, I couldn't even name half or a third even. I don't even know if I know 100 different KPIs. And by the way, how long ago did you read this book?
And just for the audience, I literally called Ed out of the blue 10 minutes ago. He was driving, and I said, hey, Ed, I want to do a sales KPI podcast. Are you free right now? And he's like, hey, I'll be home in like 5 minutes. So, like, no prep, dude. Wait, how long ago did you read this book, and how do you even remember some of these stats? It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, I think it was about 5 years ago, and I don't even remember how I came about hearing about the book, but in this role that I've been in, a guest supplier, has been challenging. It's been rewarding. It's really allowed me to just kind of trial and error and figure it out. So I went down this path to just try to find out, all right, I need to get a lot better in my knowledge. I need to broaden that. So I went to, what are the big books, and who are some of the podcasts that I should be listening to, and I think that's where it came about, how I found it. It was that I read at the same time, back to back. It was that book, and then right after that was Coaching Salespeople into Champions, which was another great book. But so I think it was about 5 years ago when I read it, and like I said, some of those things resonate and some don't. And I could visualize myself as Jason's writing this book. I could visualize myself in a conference room just discussing ad nauseum some of these different metrics. And I just remember, as I'm reading this book, just to say, what an incredible waste of time. And knowing that I've been there, I've done it, I've talked about the dumbest things in the world that don't make sense, but what makes those relevant is to be able to then group them together. And that's what his book talks about, is taking all of these types of metrics and grouping them into what metrics are effective for account management, which ones are effective for that are activity management, and understand. I can't remember the 4 breakouts, but that's what made it really make sense, is to understand all of these different KPIs and then figure out where they get plugged in. And if you're your business or you're a leader, you ask yourself the question, I want to improve upon area X. So depending on what that area is, this book really tells you, okay, these are the KPIs you want to be tracking. Here are the things that make the most sense. And here's the ones that are relational. One will impact the other. And trying to put forth effort on the right metrics. And here's one thing that I'll say, I'll go on record, you can quote me. I'm probably one of the very few sales leaders who says I don't care about revenue. And the reason why is because that is a byproduct of everything you do on the input. It's an output. What I care about is I want to drive the inputs. Yeah, that's true. That's the big one.
So true.
So that's
so many shitty sales managers will say, why aren't you generating more revenue? Why aren't you closing more deals? Why aren't you closing more sales? It's like, obviously, like I've had terrible managers and I've had amazing managers. The ones that say that don't understand that they're looking at the byproduct of all the hard work at the top of the funnel. Like exactly what you're saying. Like, so when you're managing your reps, your sales team, so instead of getting on their ass about the revenue, walk us through. I didn't want to interrupt. Keep going. Keep running with it.
Oh yeah, no. So understanding those, and this is exactly why we're here today, Brandon, is understanding those KPIs. Sales or revenue closed isn't really a KPI. Of course, it's the obviously it's one of the biggest ones because it's the make or break. But realistically, when you're talking to a rep, or even if you're a leader trying to guide a frontline manager, you really got to get that door open a little bit wider and dig a little deeper. So having those conversations is where it really starts on. So, okay, you're not at revenue. Let's go back. And this is where I had no intention of making this similarity when I said it. But one of the things that I loved about the book, Coaching Salespeople into Champions, is it talked about having those coaching sessions with your reps or with your frontline managers. Is you have them take you through the story. So you start asking the guided questions of, okay, so you missed your quarter number. All right, let's look and figure out why. So let's start talking about what goals did you have this quarter? And you go back and look at the goals. And okay, you wanted to have X amount of deals in the pipeline, or you wanted your pipeline value to be X, and you wanted to closed Y and you wanted to move to stage 6 or stage 5 or final close a number. And you start to really understand those types of goals. So like you said in the very beginning, Brandon, is you're going to have a goal, but how you get there is going to be different. So you got to map out your plan. And that's exactly what this is when a rep's not at goal, we go back and try to say, all right, what missed? Was it the activity? Was it the outbound approach, or was it the conversations? Was it the opportunity management? Did you not put enough into the pipeline, or did you not close enough deals? Because in some cases, it's not necessarily that you didn't close enough deals, it's you didn't necessarily close the highest dollar ones. So in some cases, you do got to look at that and dissect it. I'm a huge proponent of tracking the number of something. So how many opportunities got opened into the pipeline? I don't care about dollars at this point. I want to know how many opportunities did you put into the pipeline? How many opportunities were closed? Because at some point, it's the company that needs to help that rep a little bit be able to target those higher dollar opportunities. Because if I got a rep that's closing 10, 15 opportunities, and keep in mind my world's a little bit different than trying to sell software solutions. But if I got somebody closing 10 to 15 opportunities in a month, that could be great. But it could also be indicative of that they're not hitting their goal because they're closing the smaller ones. So I got to try and peel that back a little bit and look at how many opportunities are going in the pipeline, how many opportunities are closed. Now we get into value of each. What's the value of those opportunities that were introduced, the value that were closed? So those are the conversations that you have with a sales rep or a frontline manager to be able to say, what's going into the pipeline. Then you go a step back and say, all right, if your number of opportunities put into the pipeline is lower, now let's look at some of the activity. Let's look at your activity of outbound calls, outbound emails, response rates, conversation rates, and understanding that. Well, yeah, you did take off 2 weeks in the month of October, so that's fine. You had vacation. Well, that's one of the reasons maybe you didn't make it, or maybe it's because you didn't plan that, or you got injured and you had to go to the hospital, God forbid. But at least you can start to understand you need to make a mountain out of a molehill, or is it just, all right, we understand the reason why, now we need to get back to focus and start those plans. But I'll close this point by saying that what I've learned through a lot of trial and mostly error has been these little step goals are probably the most important driver towards your full goal or your completion. So, a lot of sales reps, they have annual targets, some maybe more driven on quarterly targets. But being able to really look at, all right, what am I going to do today? What am I going to do this week? What am I going to do next week? And starting to really understand how that impacts to your number, those are the drivers that the rep, the SDR, the AE, the sales manager, even director that need to be driving towards are what are those little things that are being done every day, every week in order to get to that number for the month, for the quarter, for the year.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Ed. And tracking all of these KPIs to hit those revenue numbers, one of the things that you mentioned are obviously you're tracking the calls being made, the emails being made. One of the things that we realized that's pretty important, which is difficult to track, you had mentioned connections. So connections are critical. How many calls does it take to connect with a prospect? How many connections to lead to a booked appointment? Have you found something difficult that I've struggled with is tracking sentiment? Because I think it's important to track connections, but was it a positive connection, a neutral connection, or a negative connection? Because you could send an email template, right? Send an email that gets 10 connections, 10 responses, but they're all negative. That doesn't mean that template wins over other templates. Or you can make 10 calls using a call script, have 5 connections, and the 5 people that you connected with hung up on you, right? So have you figured out a good, easy way for sales dev leads to track sentiment of their connections?
Yeah, I haven't, and I think you bring up a great point of especially the negative responses in an email in any kind of email tracking system, that's going to look like a reply rate. And you're like, all right, great, replies. But it's not. It's still better than no reply, because I think it's always better to hear a no early. And I think, Brandon, you just made a post about this on LinkedIn, is that I want to know yes and I want to know no. What I don't want to know is maybe or nothing. And those are the problematic areas. So I don't know of anything. I haven't used anything that measures sentiment in really either regard, unless you're using some kind of manual disposition. And then it becomes subjected to human error, and there's a certain error rate involved. Not that that's bad, but at some point you got to figure out, is that a 5% error rate? Is it 7.5%? What's the error rate percentage? But other than just tagging kind of manual dispositions and then being able to report off of that, I don't know of anything that systemically will track it, or at least if that's available in the tools like with InsideSales.com or SalesLoft or Outreach or anything like that.
Yeah, I noticed Outreach. So Outreach is starting to come out with sentiment, which makes total sense. It blew my mind that it took this long for the industry, like 10 years later, from predictable revenue, Aaron Ross, for people to actually realize we have to track sentiment, not just connections, and we have to track positive, negative, or neutral connections, right? Looks really cool. Outreach looks like it's doing it. I bet you Porter and SalesLoft is probably doing it or going to start doing it. I haven't tested any of those features because they're in beta. But anytime that we're looking at optimizing content, content being leveraged for calling, emailing, social selling, having connections, and if it was positive, neutral, or negative, like that's just critical. There's no other way to improve or optimize the content without having the sentiment, in my opinion. I just haven't ever found an easy way to do that. And okay, so for calls, you're saying you got to track calls made, you got to track connections, you got to track obviously sentiment, and then you got to track calls that led to booked appointments. And I think you mentioned booked appointments to appointments held, right? So meetings booked to opportunities created. What else? You had mentioned emails being sent, connections on emails, sentiment of emails, booked appointments from emails, and then social touches. Like, what else do you look at? So, like, when you wake up, Ed, and you go into the office, and you pull up Salesforce dashboards, what other KPIs are you looking at to effectively manage the highest performing sales development team?
Yeah, I think that and of course, what I really tend to put the most importance on, of course, it's an outcome, but I want to know how many meetings were booked, held, and then how many of those resulted in opportunities. Because how I've defined it, and this may be very consistent with how other organizations define it, or maybe not, but I look at the sales development channel to be responsible for the meetings being set, and then, of course, an opportunity coming from that meeting. So I want them to be involved in that process. If that meeting doesn't happen, I want them involved to reschedule. I don't want that to fall back on the AE. And I think that becomes part of the challenge, is to define that. So I'm looking at meetings, how many meetings set, and then how many opportunities are open from those meetings. And I really look, again, this is probably a byproduct of just the industry that I'm in, but 70-75% is what I'm driving towards. And that's really only because of a timeline factor. That doesn't necessarily mean the meeting resulted in a no for an opportunity. That's just simply, if I'm looking at a month, how many meetings did we book compared to how many got opened? That doesn't mean all of those meetings took place, so they hadn't been had yet. So I think 70-75% for us, and that's what I'm looking at on a regular basis. So
and that 75% is the meetings booked that resulted in an opportunity. So out of every 4 meetings, you want 3 of those to turn into opportunities, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we're trying to target 80 or 90%, like super qualified. And it was funny. I don't know if you ran through this or not, man, but so for meetings, we track meetings booked for the date that the meeting was booked. So if I cold called someone and booked an appointment today, that's where I would put that date in Salesforce. We track new meeting set date. So what is the appointment set for? So if I cold call Ed, I book it today, and the meeting's scheduled for next Friday, that's the meeting set date. And then we track 3 other KPIs with meetings. Meetings held, so the date that the meeting was held. Meeting DQ'd, the date that the meeting was disqualified. And meeting no-show, the date that the meeting was no-showed. And we're trying to hit 90% roughly meetings booked to held. And for us, if we have a new meeting held, that means that deal is progressing forward in the pipeline. Typically, at an 80-90% rate is what we want to see. But it's interesting. We were paying out our SDRs on new meetings booked, and it was like a complete chaotic shit show because all of our SDRs were saying that they booked all these appointments, right? And they were using Calendly and other scheduling apps, booking a ton of appointments, or saying that they were booking a ton of appointments, getting paid on that. And then we noticed like most of the meetings weren't being held. And we're like, we got to make a change. So we switched from paying out on new meetings booked to paying out commission on new meetings held. Everything changed. That was a game changer for us, for KPIs. Because then you've got the SDRs, they're fighting for their asses to make sure that those meetings get scheduled, that those meetings get held. They actually follow up to reschedule the meetings because they didn't already get paid on it. Like, they don't get paid if that meeting doesn't get held. So they stay on top of the AE to make sure the AE's got everything to hold that meeting, to crush it, to make sure that their calendar is clean. They stay on top of the prospect to make sure that prospect shows up. It was unbelievable the change in level of effort that we saw when we moved from paying out on booked to paying out SDRs on meeting held.
Yeah, so that's a great example of when I was trying to figure out how we were going to build the sales development channel in our company. It was a journey, and it was, where do you start? Where do you end? What things do you change throughout? And I read Trish Bertuzzi's book, The Sales Development Playbook, which is a phenomenal starting point. It's a phenomenal refreshing point, and it goes back to a lot of the 101 work of what do you want to do to make it successful. Yeah, and that it talked about comp plan, and it talked about, there's a section in there that talks about how do you incent your SDRs. And I think that's one of the measures that what you just described is you tested something and then you figured out a problem in the process and then you changed it so that the accountability was still on that sales development rep to make sure that meeting happened, because that's their goal. That's how you defined at Seamless how your SDRs are going to call, what their responsibilities for. They're responsible for that prospect showing up to a meeting and handing that off to the AE. And that's exactly what your comp, and that's a perfect example of an alignment. And that's how you're aligning what the expectation is to the comp model. And that's what when I read that book before I built this channel for us. And that was one of the things that made sense, because I could have actually very easily just bonused on meeting set. I wound up taking it a step further and bonusing it on opportunities opened. In some cases, it doesn't quite make sense depending on the industry or the product and who your customer is. But for us, I didn't want my SDR sending garbage to the field. So this is a way where I can keep them accountable to the process to make sure that they did qualify it, that there is an actual opportunity, and that's the whole comp model. And that's what was written by Trish in Sales Development Playbook, is to really focus on that. She also gave an example of tying a small part of their commission or their bonus to that deal closing. You don't want to make it too big because they're not responsible for it. They're responsible for bringing the customer to the dance, not for the whole dance itself. So I think that was important too when I was going down that path.
It makes total sense. And I know Anthony Iannarino, author of The Lost Art of Closing and The Only Sales Guide You'll Ever Need, and then also Stu Heineke, author of How to Get a Meeting with Anyone. Both of those guys, are big on making sure that you compensate people for the KPIs that they're executing on a daily basis. It's interesting, and Anthony and Stu are investors in Seamless.ai, which is great. We really appreciate that. And we've done both, where we comped SDRs for obviously booking and holding the appointments, as well as comp them for commission on the closed deal. We actually recently moved away from it just because we want all of our SDRs to be focused on filling the pipeline, executing as much, calls, emails, social touches in a value-driven, personalized way to get that appointment booked with qualified prospects. And I couldn't justify the A's are the ones that are really working, managing, and closing those opportunities. And the SDRs are the ones that are really finding, hunting, and filling that pipeline. So personally, I actually just, like to keep the divide between the two. But I think a lot of organizations, they've done both, they've mixed both. I don't know if you've got an opinion on one way or the other there about comping for those KPIs or not.
Yeah, and this I think goes back to the essence of what you and I both preach, which is I think testing is just going to be the clear indicator, and try it one way, measure results, try it another way, measure results, and start to figure out what seems to be the consistent winner. But I tend to be on the school of thought that bonus comp, any kind of comp, whether it's even base and performance, it should all be aligned to what's in the purview, what's in the responsibility of that particular person's role. And it's tough to comp a SDR on what closes because they're not involved in it, but it's the easiest way to justify it. And that's where there becomes, well, look, everyone's got to be tied to deals closing. Well, okay, I get it. And sometimes you got to be that way, but that way it gives them a little bit of skin in the game if they are competent on it on closed deals, I should say. But the other part of it is the breadth of their comp, I firmly believe, should be things that they're responsible for, which is, like you said, Brandon, you got to get into the pipeline. Like that's what your role is. That's exactly why you invest in a sales development program, is to utilize outbound effort to bring prospects into your pipeline. And that's their role. There's even comp plans that call for contribution to pipeline. So, what you're bringing to the pipeline is sometimes what you're bonused on, as opposed to deal closing. So I think that works in some cases. Again, all depends on the product, all depends on your customer, and ultimately, and there's a portion of that could really depend on the life or the sales cycle and the deal size. So if you're selling enterprise Oracle-ish like solutions, I mean, these could be multi-million-dollar deals when they close. It could also take 16 months, 20 months to close. So in that case, you may work on a whole team that is trying to drive this. And if you look at a lot of the data out there that talks about, I don't even know what it's up to now, 5.4, 5.6 decision makers involved in every decision, that just adds way more than I even want to think about when you're starting to talk about these multi-million-dollar deals and people that have to sign off on it. So in some cases, you may offer a team incentive for everybody working on this project, whether it's your marketing person, your SDR, your AE, your sales engineer, potentially sales and or product engineers if you have separate ones. So that may be a comp plan. But going back to really the whole alignment and trying to understand what is that person's role, what are they directly responsible for, and that's where the majority, if not all, of their comp should really come from. Yeah,
now, and I know we got to wrap up here shortly, but are you holding your team accountable for new MRR created or ARR created and new pipeline created, or are you really focused on the daily executional, contacts, calls, emails, social touches, connections, booked appointments? Because there's camps on both sides. Like, new MRR created, well, if they're just booking the appointment, they have no idea the potential size of the deal. Now, they could size it up based on X number of whatever, right? For us, we can size up a deal based on number of salespeople and marketers at a company that would buy licenses to Seamless, because we sell Seamless very similar to how Salesforce.com sells, licenses for all the salespeople and marketers. So it's easier for us to size up an estimated MRR or ARR. But I actually don't hold my SDRs accountable to that. I hold them accountable to booking new appointments with our ideal customers, which is anyone really that leverages Salesforce Enterprise with 50 employees or greater. Do you hold your team accountable to, new MRR created, new pipeline created, or you focus just on those daily executional KPIs?
Yeah, so I'm laser focused on the daily types of KPIs. I don't look at revenue contribution, and it's not necessarily because I don't care, but there's a good part of me that doesn't in that regard, and I'll tell you why. And this is where it all goes to the product you're selling and who you're selling it to. So like what you said is you have a rough guesstimation of, based on how many sales and marketers people have, that's going to be contingent on potentially what a deal size could be, or at least a starting point for that matter. In my world, it's contingent on many different factors, and fortunately, I have a lot of data before we pick up a phone call. I know where that customer is located. I know how big that property is. I know what kind of chain it is. If it's a chain, I know what kind of segment they're in. So I've got a lot of market data before I do anything with that. And that's how we start to figure out what's going to be priority 1, priority 2. So we start taking tangible factors like that, no different than how any other company builds an ICP, an ideal customer profile. You're doing the same thing, is you're trying to define that and then go find those prospects that meet that. And then if you're doing your due diligence, at least on the ideal customer profile, then it becomes starting to measure those things. I would imagine, if you haven't, Brandon, I imagine you're probably going to soon, is that you've got an idea of when you go get somebody, what that value is going to be, and then how much work is represented to close it. So in some case, you could say selling to an organization with 500 salespeople is going to not only bring more revenue, but also I'm sure it takes a little bit more time to close all 500 versus a sales shop that maybe has 3 to 5. So at some point, you've got a measure of effort, whereas the company, you want to try and dictate to that SDR, hey, here's your blend of who these prospects are and what they look like. So go get them. And you're doing it based on those factors. So then as an SDR, who do I want to call? Because I could go whale hunting and I could go try and call these 500 rep shops. I may not be getting a great bonus every month. It may not even be every quarter, but I can go get them. Or I can start to go get the smaller ones, because those may be the less barrier to entry. So I think that's where, when you start I don't measure it because of that reason only, is I want to structure at least the prospect list enough to where I can throttle in what's an opportunity, what's closest to an opportunity right now. What trigger events are happening? Trigger events are huge, of what's going to increase the propensity to buy, and understanding those trigger events. For us, it could be a lot of things. It could be a NASCAR race in a certain area. It could be the Democratic National Convention. It could be the Arnold Schwarzenegger Expo that happens every year in Columbus. Those are some big events that happen. So rewind 3 months, 4 months, and you start to go, and we start to use those trigger events. There's things like new hotel chains coming out. Hilton's created a couple new ones. So those are ones, when you see that one's being built, boom, that's a trigger event. So you can use, depending on the data that you have, those trigger events, but it all comes down to really the effort exerted, and that starts to help facilitate, or I guess build the pipeline. And that's one of the reasons I don't like looking at the revenue attainable, because that becomes a better conversation to have, to say, all right, you brought in 10 opportunities in the pipeline. Let's look at what those 10 were. Were they all the 3 to 5 sales reps ones, like you said, Brandon, or is there a nice blend? That becomes a discussion to have. And that's what I like, being able to throttle as much as I can.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, Ed, I know it's Saturday. Out of the blue, I really appreciate all your advice on the sales management strategies and KPIs that we should leverage to maximize sales development success. Want to close this off with a big thank you for all the tips and advice you shared tonight. And then lastly, I'd love to just get your closing top tip, secret piece of advice for helping get your team to number one, the top performing sales development team. If you had to summarize all your experience, what's the one thing in sales management that you would leave the audience with?
Yeah, thanks. I think the one thing that I really have tried to learn over the years, and it's very tough because I'm stubborn, but try to really understand that sales is a process. It's a journey. It's not an event. And I've been working with Dion Mishler for a while, and that's what she says. She has in a lot of what she's told me is this is a whole process. This is not just one thing that happens. You don't build up and culminate into one thing. It's a process, and it's tough to understand that sometimes because we're all competitive. We all want things now. It's all about gratification, and it's tough when you're a leader. It takes a heck of a lot more patience. It takes a hell of a lot more time, and that's I think what has been for me being able to look at least at my current position, but over the past years that I've been in sales and leadership is understanding that I know so much more today than I did 5 years ago. And that hopefully is represented in the teams that I've built and the success that we've had. So that's, I guess, the parting words is that this whole thing is a process and it's not an event. And as long as you're reflecting and looking at what could I do better, and then you do little bite-sized chunks to change it, that's what shows the upward progression. As well as investors needing to tell you, hey, you need to get revenue by X. But other than that, it really is just focus on the small wins and build that progression.